Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Have you ever had one of those moments where your ordinary day suddenly becomes extraordinary? Where something so simple changes everything? Well, that's exactly what happened to me on what I thought would be just another boring Tuesday. The morning started the way it always did. Gray clouds hung heavy in the sky, looking like they might open up and pour rain any second. The familiar smell of coffee filled my kitchen, mixing with the quiet hum of the old refrigerator that had been with me for 15 years. I was doing what I did every Tuesday morning, sitting at my wooden kitchen table, going through the pile of mail that had built up over the past few days. Most of it was the usual stuff, credit card offers, promising amazing deals, grocery store, flyers with sales I'd probably never use, and those annoying catalogs for things I didn't need. There were a couple of bills to the electric company and the phone company, both wanting their monthly share of my retirement money. At 53, I have to admit my life had fallen into a pattern. Not a bad pattern, mind you, just ... predictable. Wake up at 7, coffee by 7:30, check the mail, maybe water the plants if they looked thirsty. My 2 kids had grown up and moved away years ago, bless their hearts, and now it was just me and Rufus, my 12-year-old golden retriever, living in this house that sometimes felt way too big for just the 2 of us. Most days, the quiet didn't bother me, actually. I'd grown to appreciate it after all those years of chaos when the kids were young. But lately, I'd been feeling something I couldn't quite name. Restless, maybe? Like I was waiting for something, though I had no idea what. That's when I saw it, tucked right between a bright red envelope advertising a new pizza place and a postcard from my dentist reminding me about my next cleaning. There was something different, a real envelope. Not the cheap white kind that comes with bills, but the good stuff, thick, cream-colored paper that felt substantial in my hands, heavy like it mattered. What really caught my attention was the writing on the front. My name and address were written by hand, actually written with a real pen in deep blue ink. The letters were carefully formed, neat and confident. When was the last time I'd gotten a handwritten letter? I honestly couldn't remember. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling its weight. There was something almost magical about it in our world of emails and text messages. The return address was printed in the same careful handwriting, Mark Ashton, followed by an address in Portland, Oregon, Mark Ashton, Oregon. I didn't think I knew anyone in Oregon. The name seemed familiar somehow, like a song you can't quite remember but know you've heard before. It tickled the back of my mind, creating a little itch I couldn't scratch. Rufus must have sensed something was different, 'cause he got up from his favorite spot by the back door and padded over to me. Kez's tail wagged slowly as he nudged my hand, with his wet nose, probably wondering why I'd stopped my usual routine of sorting mail into neat piles. Keep, throw away. Deal with later. I gave his golden head a gentle scratch, but my eyes stayed fixed on the envelope. What do you think? Boy, I asked him quietly, who's Mark Ashton? The name kept rolling around in my head. Mark ... Mark ... Wait a minute. Didn't my cousin Jane have a friend named Mark back in college? I tried to picture him. A quiet guy, kind of artistic, with dark hair that always looked like he'd just run. His fingers through it. We'd all hung out together during a few summer breaks, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, but that seemed impossible. Why would Jane's old college friend be writing to me after all this time? We'd barely known each other back then. Just casual hellos and shared conversations at barbecues and beach trips. Maybe he was writing to everyone from the old group. But Jane would have mentioned something like that during one of our weekly phone calls. She tells me everything. What? She had for breakfast, what her neighbor's dog did, what she watched on TV the night before. A little knot of worry started forming in my stomach, mixing with curiosity like oil and water. What could Jane's old college friend possibly want to write to me about after 3 decades? Was someone sick? Had something happened to Jane and she'd asked him to contact me? My mind started spinning through possibilities, each one making the knot tighter. The house seemed extra quiet all of a sudden. Even Rufus had settled back down, resting his chin on my foot like he always did when he sensed I was thinking about something important. The coffee maker let out its final click, signaling the pot was done brewing. Outside, the threatened rain finally started, soft drops tapping against the kitchen window like gentle fingers, creating little rivers that blurred my view of the bird feeder in the backyard. I took a slow sip of my coffee, hoping the warmth would calm the fluttery feeling that had started in my chest. The envelope felt almost alive in my other hand, like it was pulsing with secrets. There was something intimate about it. This unexpected piece of my past showing up on an ordinary Tuesday morning, demanding attention. Part of me wanted to set it aside, maybe call Jane first to see if she knew anything about it. I could wait until after lunch, or even until tonight when I usually did my thinking. But another part of me, the part that had been feeling restless and bored with the sameness of my days, was practically vibrating with curiosity. What could be the harm in opening one letter? It's not like it was going to bite me. I reached for the sterling silver letter opener that Tom had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary. It was one of the few nice things I'd kept after he passed, and holding it always made me feel connected to him somehow. The silver was cool and smooth. In my hand, familiar and comforting. With steady fingers, I slid the blade under the envelope's flap. The sound of paper tearing seemed incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen, almost harsh. Rufus opened one eye to look at me, then closed it again when he decided nothing exciting was happening. Inside the envelope, there was a single sheet of the same heavy cream-colored paper, folded neatly into thirds like people used to do before email made everything instant and careless. The blue ink flowed across the page in the same careful handwriting I'd admired on the envelope. I unfolded it slowly, my heart doing a strange little dance in my chest. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs, but something about it felt important, significant. I smoothed it flat on the table and began to read. "Dear Sarah," it began, and seeing my name written in that careful script made everything feel more real somehow. He started by reintroducing himself, which was thoughtful, since it had been so long. He reminded me gently of how we'd known each other through Jane, acknowledging how much time had passed and how different our lives probably were now. His tone was warm but careful, like someone who wasn't sure if they'd be welcome but hoped they would be. Then he wrote something that made me sit up straighter. He said he'd recently been going through some old boxes, the kind we all have tucked away in closets and basements. It's full of memories we can't quite throw away. In one of those boxes, he'd found an old photograph from one of those college summers we'd all spent together. It was a candid shot, he explained, taken at a barbecue at Jane's parents' lake house. He described being caught in the background of the photo, laughing about something, his hands frozen mid-gesture like he was telling a story. But that wasn't what had made him write the letter. The photo had brought back a flood of memories, he wrote. Not just of that particular day, but of that whole summer. The feeling of being young and full of possibilities when the future stretched ahead like an empty road waiting to be traveled. The way everything seemed more vivid back then, colors brighter, conversations more meaningful. Dreams bigger and more possible. But then came the part that really stopped me cold. He wrote about a conversation he'd overheard me having that day. At the barbecue, I'd been talking to Jane's younger brother. What was his name? Mike? Matt? About wanting to travel, specifically about wanting to see the Northern Lights someday. I set the letter down for a moment, trying to remember. I really said that. It seemed like something I might have said back then, when I was young and thought I'd have all the time in the world to chase dreams. The Northern Lights, the aurora borealis dancing green and blue and purple across the night sky in places so far north they seemed like another world. I picked up the letter again, hungry to read more. Mark wrote that he'd never forgotten my description of how I imagined the lights would look. I'd apparently talked about them dancing across the darkness like silk scarves in the wind, painting the sky in colors that didn't have names. He said I'd describe the vastness of it all, the endless sky, the silence, the feeling of being small under something so magnificent. What amazed me was that he remembered the passion in my voice when I'd talked about it. I barely remembered the conversation, but he'd carried it with him all these years like a small treasure. The letter continued, and I found myself holding my breath as I read. He wrote that he'd finally made that trip himself just a few years ago. He'd traveled all the way up to Alaska in the middle of winter, staying in a small cabin with no electricity, waiting for the perfect conditions to see the aurora borealis. He described the experience in simple but beautiful words. The incredible cold that made his breath freeze in the air. The silence so complete it seemed to have weight. And then, when the lights finally appeared, the way they moved across the sky like living things, shifting and dancing and pulsing with an energy that seemed almost magical. But here's the part that made my eyes fill with tears. He wrote that when he finally saw those lights after traveling thousands of miles and wading through several cloudy nights, he thought of me, the young woman at the barbecue with a faraway look in her eyes, streaming of dancing lights in a sky she'd never seen. He said that standing there in the Alaskan wilderness, watching the aurora paint the darkness in impossible colors, he'd wondered if I'd ever made it there myself, if I'd gotten to fulfill that casual dream I'd shared so long ago. The letter ended simply and warmly. He said he hoped life had been kind to me over the years. He didn't ask for anything, no request to get back in touch, no suggestion that we should meet or even correspond. He just signed it warmly, Mark Ashton, and left it at that. I read the letter again, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. My coffee sat forgotten on the table, growing cold while I tried to process what I'd just received. This wasn't a love letter or some kind of romantic gesture from the past. It wasn't someone trying to sell me something or asking for a favor. It was something much more precious and rare, a genuine human connection reaching across 30 years, sparked by nothing more than a forgotten photograph and a half-remembered conversation about the Northern Lights. It was, I realized, absolutely incredible. Personal yet respectful, intimate yet distant. He remembered something about me'd almost forgotten myself, the passion in my voice. I tried to recall if that younger version of Sarah life had not exactly unfolded the way she'd planned there had been joy. Yes, my wonderful marriage to Tom, my children, but Alsacum promises, responsibilities, losses, fed dreams of seeing the Northern Lights had faded, buried under mortgages, tuition fees, and the everyday demands of life. Tom hadn't been much of a traveler, and no. Now I was here in this quiet house with a letter from a near stranger who remembered a dream I'd let go of. A wave of emotion washed over me, nostalgia, strange sort of validation, a poignant sadness for the time past, and in darneth at all, a flicker of something's warmth that someone had carried that tiny fragment of me with them for so long. I looked out the window at Therain. Thinking about the aurora he described, I pictured the colors, thistlelands, and I felt an unexpected kinship with this man, Mark Ashton, who lived across the country in Oregon. The letter felt like a small, perfect pebble drop adento, the still pond of my life, sending ripples outwards. What do you do with something like that? Ignore it, file, eat away? Or do you write back? The question hung in the air, as quiet and potent as letter itself, for the rest of that day, and the day after. Mark's letter occupied a corner of my mind. I'd be reading a book or pulling weeds in the garden between rain showers, and the thought of it would drift back in the image of him standing under the Alaskan ski, thinking of a conversation from decades ago. It felt surreal. I did call Jane, ostensibly just to chat, but steered the conversation towards her college days, casually asking whatever happened to some of her old friends. When I mentioned Mark Ashton, she paused. Mark Quo. That's a name from the past. The quiet artist guy, right? Moved out west years ago, Oregon. I think. Why do you ask? He hesitated. Telling Jane felt complicated, not because it was wrong, but back because it felt intensely private, this strange little connection. So I hedged. Oh, no reason, really just reminiscing. I guess his name popped into my head. Jana didn't push it, launching into a story about another college friend instead. After I hung up, I felt a pang of guilt for not being entirely honest, but also a sense of protectiveness over the letter end, the feeling it had stirred in me. It was mine somehow that evening, sitting in me, favorite armchair with Rufus asleep at. My feet, I pulled the letter out agony, smoothed the creases, tracing his signature. What harm could there be in replying just a simple acknowledgement? A thank you for sharing the memory. It wasn't like I was looking for anything. Tom had been gone 5 years now in Willethie. Sharp edges of grief had softened. I hadn't felt any inclination to date or seek out new romantic entanglements. This felt different. It wasn't about romance. It was about resonance, about being Sinevan across a gulf of time and distant Chesso. I took out my own stationery, not as fancy as his, but a nice pale blue set I kept for thank you notes. Finding the right words took time. I didn't want to sound overly eager nor dismissive, as started by thanking him for his thoughtful letter, saying how unexpected and touching it was. I admitted I barely remembered the specific conversation about the Northern Lights, but the Memoriath, those lake house summers, was vivid. It told him a little about my life, keeping it brief, mentioning my children, where grown, that I was living in the same town. Thought I'd lost my husband. I felt it was important to be honest about that. I added that, no, I hadn't made it to Seath Aurora myself, but his description sounded incredible, and it was kind of theme to think of me. I kept it simple, friendly. Matching his tone, I didn't say guessed, keeping in touch, just wished him well before I could second guess myself. I addressed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, dropping it inside with a decisive clink. As I walked back to the house, the evening air cool and damp after the rain, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the simple act of connection, of responding to an unexpected ripple. Whatever happened next, if anything, felt secondarito. That a week passed, then 10 days, I found myself checking the mail with a little more anticipation than usual, casting myself for being silly. Hep probably wouldn't write back. Why should his letter had served its purpose? Sharing a memory, my reply. Was just Pollock closure. Life settled back in toys. Comfortable rhythm. Rufus needed his walks. The garden needed tending. My book club was meeting on Thursday, yet thought of Mark Ashton lingered. A quiet background note. Then another cream-colored envelope appeared. This time I recognized the handwriting. Immediately my breath caught slightly as I carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen bell while I made myself a cup of tea, deliberately slowing myself down. This time his letter was a bit longer. He responded warmly to mine, expressing condolences for my husband's passing, sharing briefly that he'd also been through a divorce years ago, which was part of why he'd moved to Oregon for a fresh start. He wrote about his work. He was a landscape photographer, Wixom, how made perfect sense. He talked about the beauty of the Pacific Northwest, the forests, the coastline. Heast about my children, what they were doing. He also picked up on my mention oft Lake House summers and shared an author-specific memory, a time a few of yous, including him and me, had taken a canoe on the lake late one afternoon and gotten caught in a sudden downpour. Long as we paddled back, soaked to the skin, I remembered that day vague a bit. His description brought it back into focus. The warm rain, the smell of the water, the shared silly adventure. Heasked if I still enjoyed being near the water. It was uncanny how he seemed to remember these small details that resonated. We started writing back and forth regularly after that, not every day, but maybe once a week. An envelope pulled arrive from Oregon, and I'd send Donnie back from Pennsylvania. Our letters grew longer, more open. We talked about books. We were reading frustrations with technology, the changing seasons, the joys and challenges of navigating life. Past 50, we shared stories of our families, or pasts, our quiet hopes for the future. It was a conversation unfolding slowly, thoughtfully. On paper, there was a refreshing lack of pressure, a fixed expectation. He sent me a photograph he'd taken, a stunning shot of Haystack Rockin', the Oregon coast shrouded in mist. I sent him a picture of the first crocus pushing through the soil in my garden. Well earned about each other's lives. Nothro Curated online profiles, but through carefully chosen words, shared vulnerabilis, and the simple act of taking the time to write to communicate. We discovered a shared sense of humor, a similar outlook on many things, a mutual respect that deepened with each letter, the subtle tension I'd felt initially had dissolved, replaced by a comfortable, engaging intimacy. It wasn't romantic, not in the way Pio usually mean. It was deeper than that, somehow a meeting of minds, a companionship forged through ink and paper across miles and years, one afternoon reading his latest letter describing a hike he'd taken in the Columbia River Gorge. A thought arcaretto, me bold and clear, I wanted to hear his voice, the idea of transitioning from letters to a phone call. Felt like a big step, almost risky, potentially changing unique dynamic we built, but the curiosity, the desire to add a third dimension to this surprising connection was undeniable. I finished my tea, the cream-colored envelope resting on the table, beside me a tangible link to this person who had unexpectedly walked back into my life, or rather written himself into it, enriching it in ways I could never have predicted when I first saw that handwritten address weeks ago. The question now wasn't just whether I'd see the Northern Lights someday, but whether I was brave enough to pick up the phone. Night took me another week to work up, then or if it felt strangely old-fashioned deranging a phone call in. His next letter tucked in after a paragraph about treeing too. Photograph hummingbirds, I added a postscript. It's been so nice it's janging letters. I wrote my pen hovering for a second. I find myself wondering what your voice sounds like after all these years. If you're ever inclined, perhaps we could chat on the phone. Sometime I included my number and tried not to overthink it, as I mailed. Letter his reply came a few days later, quicker than usual, arriving, not in an envelope but as an email. He'd found my email address from an old alumni list Jane had circulated. Years ago, the subject line simply read, yes. Inside it said he'd love to talk and suggested a time the following Saturday, accounting for the time difference. Just like that, me stomach did a nervous flip. Saturday's end, suddenly very close. What would we talk about? Would it be awkward? Would Theozy? Intimacy of our letters vanish in real-time conversation. Saturday arrive as Sony, and Bright Eye spent the morning gardening. Trying to distract myself, but me gaze kept drifting to the clock at the appointed time. I sat in my armchair, phone feeling unnaturally heavy in me hand. It rang precisely on schedule. I took a breath and answered, "Hello, Sarah, it's Mark Ashton." His voice, it wasn't what I expected, somehow deeper, warmer, with a slight hesitancy that mirrored my own nervousness, but after the initial few awkward seconds of "Can you harm?" "Okay, and thanks for calling," the conversation began to flow surprisingly. It felt like picking up a thread already woven through our letters. Talked for over an hour. We laughed about the canoe incident he remembered, filled in more gaps about the intervening years, discussed the photos we'd exchanged. Hearing his voice add inflection and warmth to the words idly read before was lovely. It made the connection feel more real, more present. There were comfortable silences, calm moments, where we both just seemed to be processing this transition from paper to voice. He asked more about Tom, listening with quiet empathy as I shared a little about our life together and the void his passing had left. I asked about his photography, and he spoke passionately about capturing light and landscape, about the patience it required. There was no pretense, no pressure, just a people talking, sharing their lives from across country. As we were winding down Thekel, he said something that stayed with him. "You know, Sarah, getting that old fatute and writing to you, it was an impulse a bit. One of the best impulses I've had in a long time. It's been unexpectedly under reconnecting like this. I felt a warmth spread through me." "Me too, Mark," I replied, and I meant it wholeheartedly. Tree. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while. The afternoon sun streaming through the window. The house didn't feel quite so big or so quiet anymore. This connection, born from a forgotten memory and a handwritten letter, had blossomed into something quietly profound. It wasn't about filling a void left by Tomar, about seeking romance. It was about finding a kindred spirit at a time. Ilias expected it, a reminder that meaningful connections can appear in the most surprising ways at any stage of life. It was about mutual respect, shared history filtered through time, and the simple, powerful act of being seen and heard. The unbelievable part wasn't some dramatic twist, it was the quiet miracle. This unfolding friendship itself. Etha gently nudged me out of my comfortable, predictable rhythm, reminding of the young woman who dreamed of northern lights, but also grounding me in the quiet contentment of the present. I didn't know where this connection with Mark would lead, whether we'd ever meet in person, or if we just continue to share our lives through letters and occasional calls. And strangely, that uncertainty didn't bother me. The journey itself, the rediscovery, and the sharing was the gift. Looking out at my garden bathed in the late afternoon light, I felt a sense of quiet gratitude, a gentle expansion in my own heart. The pebble dropped in the pond hadn't just created ripples, it felt like it had led in the